in 2022 at QTRIC, we had launched our first zero emissions bus database because nobody actually knew how many electric buses and hydrogen fuel cell buses are actually on the ground. And we started counting them up. And with all the federal money going into this landscape and all of the talk about decarbonizing public transit at the municipal level, given all the municipal declarations of climate emergency, you would think there's thousands of electric buses on the road. But in fact, there were just over 200 battery electric buses on the road. But to the credit of a lot of cities, there were over 1,000 that were promised, but still nowhere near that 5,000 target of actually on the road.
Canadian cities, home to over 82% of our population, are key battlegrounds in the fight against climate change. Our urban areas are not just centers of economic activity and cultural exchange, they are also significant contributors of greenhouse gas emissions. Cities account for over 70% of global CO2 emissions, most of which come from industrial and motorized transport systems. The urgency to decarbonize resonates across all Canadian cities, from bustling metropolises like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, to the charming streets of Halifax and Quebec City. Decarbonizing cities means rethinking our urban fabric, from the energy that powers our homes and buildings to the way we move around.
When you talk about the large cities in Canada, like Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, I would say around 60%, some are higher, 60% of the carbon emissions come from buildings in cities in Canada. It is as big as transportation and definitely in line also with industry as well. What's very clear is you cannot reach climate change targets, not here in Canada, not anywhere, unless you decarbonize the building sector.
It's a complex task requiring input and action from a wide variety of stakeholders, but one that holds immense potential for innovation, job creation, and a healthier environment for future generations of Canadians. TheFutureEconomy.ca spotlight on decarbonizing cities looks at the challenges and solutions for reducing the GHG emissions of Canada's urban hubs, with 4 industry experts providing their insights on what must be done now, and by who, for Canada to achieve our city decarbonization goals. In the heart of our cities, buildings stand as silent yet significant contributors of carbon emissions. Homes, commercial buildings, office towers, and public spaces alike all play a role. But where do all these emissions come from? There's a lot of nuance to consider.
Look, in my background, a building like that, it's built with cement. Cement is after water, is the most second-use substance on the planet. And cement, until very recently, is very carbon intensive to make. They have a very big carbon footprint, as is steel. So these are 2 major building materials. And then on top of that, you have to actually then operate that building as well. So your energy, you typically use fossil fuels for heating, and then you use electricity for lighting and cooling.
This is why Canadian cities are now embracing greener building technologies, from advanced insulation materials to smart energy systems that promise not just reduced emissions, but also enhanced livability. The challenge is that these solutions don't come cheap. Heat pumps are said to be able to reduce homes' electricity use by 50% compared to furnaces and baseboard heaters. This also means that they result in long-term savings. However, the upfront cost of a heat pump can put many homeowners and developers off installing them. Supporting developers and building owners in investing in low-carbon solutions is where the government must step in.
They need to help that industry, like many others, to get over that hump, which is that extra cost of the heat pumps, the extra cost of the design services, the extra cost of having low-carbon cement. They need to help them over that hump. And that means with grants, or tax credits, incentives to just help them. They do it with oil and gas. They do it with other industries. They throw money at car makers for years. They need to do the same with the building industry because that will help them to move faster and accelerate to get to that level of performance that we would need to expect from buildings in a carbon-constrained world, in a low-carbon economy.
Once the cost has been addressed, Canadian cities need to look at what to prioritize. And the focus isn't only on new builds.
We need to focus on the existing buildings. The larger existing buildings, they're almost more important than the new buildings because they already have embodied carbon. So the carbon, the built building has already been expended. So the retrofit part is that actually results in immediate reduction in carbon versus a new building. Even if you build it with zero carbon, it still will have carbon emissions associated with it for some time before you kind of work off your carbon budget, before it becomes neutral and then actually results in real reduction. But the existing buildings, you can actually get to the target way faster because the embodied carbon is already there, and you can make improvements to those buildings operationally so that they consume, clean electricity like hydroelectricity in Canada, so you can electrify those buildings, so you can really decarbonize them.
On top of that, the creation of a market for energy-efficient solutions is crucial to this task. No one is better placed to do this than Canadian governments.
The government can use its procurement power and saying by 2030, they only will use office space in buildings that are zero carbon. So they're using the procurement power of the federal government to transform the industry into risk zero carbon for the industry.
When it comes to our buildings, our city-owned buildings, we've got a group that is looking at how to create energy efficiency through retrofits. What are the types of things that we need to use? The products we need to use? What are the types of retrofits we can do? We're doing this in partnership with the private sector as well. So we have a downtown incentive program for conversions from office space to residential. And a large reason for that is to create complete communities downtown so that people can live in a place that's amenity rich and they don't have to rely on personal vehicles to get to all of the things that their daily routine requires.
With the government working with stakeholders to create markets for green buildings, it puts the role that our built environment plays in a sustainable future front and center. But buildings are just one part of the equation for decarbonization. While green buildings will improve our capacity to live sustainably, our city streets and transit systems are the arteries through which urban life flows. Here, the challenge is not only to reduce emissions, but to reimagine how we move within the urban landscape. The transportation sector is a major contributor to Canada's GHG emissions, accounting for over a quarter of total emissions. Canada's high reliance on cars for commuting plays a significant role in this. The good news is that the uptake of electric vehicles in Canada has been showing significant growth. In the first 9 months of 2023, out of the 1.3 million new vehicles registered in Canada, over 130,000 were either battery electric or plug-in hybrids. As we anticipate further growth in this uptake over the next few years, we have to ask whether our cities are ready for an influx of EVs and how our municipalities will answer.
One example I would give is sort of what happened in BC when it comes to the EV readiness. So a bunch of municipalities adopted 100% EV readiness bylaw for new construction of multi-unit residential buildings and just residential buildings altogether. So what that means is if you're a developer and you're putting a condo up, 100% of the stalls don't have to have a charger, but they're EV ready, so that if somebody wants to put a charger, they only have to pay $1,500 or $1,000 to put a charger in. They don't have to pay $10,000 to upgrade the conduits and upgrade the electricity and all of that to be able to install a charger in their parking spot.
Canadian cities must be able to learn best practices from one another in terms of how to create the right environment for the adoption of EVs. This means introducing the right incentives and tax credits and installing infrastructure wherever needed. However, the path to decarbonization is not just about switching vehicle types. It's also about rethinking our entire approach to urban mobility, and that means building more electrified and low-carbon transit routes that take people from suburbs into cities and almost anywhere within the city itself.
When we look at the three technologies that are really substantively out there for public transit, it's battery electric buses with conductive charging, it's hydrogen fuel cell electric buses with a range of hydrogen supply across Canada, and it's renewable natural gas fuels pumped into CNG buses that exist already. Those are three winners. Are there more innovative or futuristic technologies down the road for public transit? Yeah, of course. There's all kinds of innovations, but the big problems have been solved. There's enough technology now in the marketplace to solve most of public transit agencies' needs.
But it's one thing to have technologies that can enable the decarbonization of our transport sector, and another entirely to actually implement them within an existing urban environment.
The big challenge ahead for public transit is the infrastructure, but not just the chargers on their own. It's knowing where to put them, exactly precisely where the most number of your buses will crisscross to utilize these things, and then being able to rip up the sidewalks and install all this infrastructure. The cost of it is one thing, the complexity of that is just extraordinary. Sometimes the best place to put these things is on the property of a mall, where a lot of buses pull in. Sometimes the mall owner, and malls are privately owned, they don't want buses there. So you can't just rip up the sidewalk and install what you want. And there's 5 layers of government you have to work through to get a charger installed there. And then the second challenge comes in tandem with that. As soon as you get the buses out the road and you're starting to install these chargers, well, right now, everybody's scrambling to find the non-existent people who are the technicians who know how to maintain these buses and their electrical powertrains. It becomes very costly, very complicated from a labor perspective, and almost impossible to recruit right now because nobody's graduating out of these programs.
The challenges and solutions are evident, but what about the in-between? How do we go from one to the other?
Right now, we don't have married energy transportation policies in Ontario, in Alberta, and Saskatchewan, in British Columbia, and Quebec. It does not exist. And that is a gap. I can give you one example of where that gap is very clear. At the federal level, we recognize renewable natural gas as a clean fuel. You can get credits for it. You can make money off it if you produce it. But we don't recognize renewable natural gas as a clean fuel at Infrastructure Canada, where there's money funding zero emissions buses. RNG in a CNG bus is not recognized as a zero emissions or low emissions vehicle that would generate eligible credit in that funding program. So one branch of government says it's a clean fuel, another branch of government that deals with the actual vehicle side says it's not. That disconnect means it doesn't get launched, even though the supply chain's building itself out, the clientele it needs to sell to is not allowed to buy it.
It's obvious that without government leadership on decarbonization, jurisdictions within Canada will not align their policies and objectives, and this mismatch will continue to hold us back in our decarbonization journey. Decarbonizing cities requires significant investment, innovative policies, and a collective will to change together. Balancing economic growth with environmental sustainability, ensuring equitable access to clean energy, and overcoming institutional inertia are just some of the hurdles on this path. The political will to enact bold measures while addressing stakeholder concerns and raising public awareness of the benefits of each of us reducing our own emissions are absolutely crucial to coordinating Canada's approach to urban GHG reduction. This means government and industry leaders coming together to spread awareness and provide assurance to the public about the future of this transition.
We have to kind of figure out, one, how do we manage the cost? And two, how do we allocate it in a way that is more equitable and ensures affordability? It's a very legitimate concern. What we need to do there is to be able to manage this, so help out the most vulnerable segment of our population, but also understand to what extent is this an upfront cost versus a long-term increase in total cost of ownership. So for example, in the case of an electric vehicle, you could be saving a lot of money on fuel, right? Like on gasoline by electrifying. And because the electric vehicle is much more efficient, you can pay for much less energy. You end up with overall energy savings, cost savings. We need to be able to communicate that to consumers, but also in some cases, we need to be able to have financing programs that can help alleviate that sort of barrier to entry that is associated with the upfront cost, and be able to kind of unlock the cost benefits that come later on.
Calgary, the epicenter of Canada's oil and gas industry, has seen firsthand the polarization surrounding conversations on emission reduction.
One of the big things we had to do is get out of our own way, frankly. We talked about having a climate plan, a climate declaration, and we hummed and hawed about it a little bit, and we were caught in a place where we thought that the message we were putting out might be perceived in a negative manner by the energy sector. And so we really didn't do much in terms of pushing for a climate declaration until 2021. What happened when we made that declaration was a lot of pushback from people who see things as black and white. or good or bad. So if you are declaring a climate emergency, you obviously must be anti-energy sector, is how it was portrayed. And that's the polarization that occurred. We were strong enough to get through that, and we were able to change the narrative and talk about the fact that the energy sector has actually been the one that's leading the transformation of clean energy and how do we do things in a more responsible manner. So we actually changed the narrative and said that Calgary is the place you want to be if you want to practice clean tech, if you want to practice the innovations that are needed to truly transform the energy sector. And as a municipality, we are partners with that sector because our declaration very much mirrors the types of emissions goals and targets that they have as well.
Governments have to understand how to convey the benefits of urban decarbonization to all Canadians, but also ensure that those benefits reach everyone.
One of the biggest opportunities for cities is actually electrification will enable a lot of environmental benefits beyond just climate-related benefits. If we think about transportation and electrification of transportation, that will significantly improve on the air quality of our cities, and it would come with a lot of health benefits in making our cities more livable and healthier and more suitable for thriving population. The other aspect as well is the economic opportunities that are coming along. We'll think about all the heat pumps that we need to install, all the chargers that we need to install, even some of the manufacturing that we're doing on electric vehicles. So economic benefits, economic opportunities, savings associated with that. If you switch over to electricity, you're going to save a lot of cost on energy bills. So you're going to be paying less for energy, which enables people to have more to spend in their communities.
Alberta's current investment in clean tech is about $1 billion a year. And this is creating 20,000 jobs or so and about $4 billion in GDP. If we were able to ramp that up over time, if we were to invest $5 billion, we would generate 170,000 new jobs and we would contribute $61 billion to GDP by 2050. So I think it's that kind of tangible information and that incremental growth. If you're able to show that to people, it makes a lot more sense.
Achieving buy-in from all corners of society, including industry and our various levels of government, is crucial to foster collaboration aimed at driving decarbonization.
I'm frankly not interested in painting industry as the bad actor in all of this. Industry has a very big role to play, and I think we need to be working closely in concert with them. And it's also not healthy when the provincial government is at odds with the federal government, and the two of them have very oppositional stances, because we're left in the middle as the municipality still having to deliver on something. So I think the polarizing language and the unhealthy debate has to end, and the proper dialogue and civic discourse has to continue.
So we asked our 4 experts for their calls to action on what must be done now, and by who, to ensure that Canadian cities can achieve their decarbonization goals. Thomas Mueller, President and CEO of the Canada Green Building Council, emphasizes the need to invest further in the building sector to support it in its decarbonization mission.
The building industry traditionally, and not just in Canada, has the lowest percentage investment of any industry typically. It's very low. There needs to be a comprehensive rather than a piecemeal approach to the building sector. We need to start to invest in that industry. We need to invest in innovation. We need to invest in workforce development and to drive that industry forward. It cannot carry on the way it has. It's a very traditional industry, but the challenge is that buildings last a long time. And the impact, the investment we make today, that building will still be around by 2050. And many buildings will still be around by 2100. And you won't have many opportunities to retrofit them. You retrofit these buildings every 30 years, 25, 30 years. So the investment you make right now is really important.
Josipa Petrunic, President and CEO of QTRIC, the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium, emphasizes the importance of a national level framework that can help Canada align its priorities on urban transportation.
The federal government must create a transportation energy policy framework and strategy with specific targets and allied incentives aligned with a spectrum of low and zero carbon fuels. So that would include integrating Natural Resources Canada, Transport Canada, Infrastructure Canada, and the Canada Infrastructure Bank as a financing tool, bringing those 4 parties together to identify specific targets of how many buses, how many coach vehicles, how many trucks, and how many cars do we want to be on the road as a number or a percentage of our overall fleet across Canada by 2030, 2035, 2040, 2045, and 2050? And what fuels will we recognize as achieving the zero emissions or sub-zero emissions targets that we set out, and therefore creating the incentives and the punishments for not hitting those combined targets? That would be an integrated framework for the next generation and the next evolution in the decarbonization of our transportation market.
For Mo Kabara, Vice President of the Transition Accelerator, the government must establish a clear vision of what decarbonization is going to look like down the road, set the policy framework that enables that vision, and importantly, communicate that vision to all stakeholders and Canadians.
So one is finance, basically a clear articulation of the financial snapshot of what transition is going to be and how that cost will be allocated. The second thing is really understanding the pace in different sectors. Understanding, what success looks like in 2030, what success looks like in 2040. We can't get this whole thing done overnight. We need to understand the pace, because the pace is going to dictate the needs on the infrastructure side, and the infrastructure needs are going to dictate the labor side, and the labor side is going to dictate the training. So it all kind of flows together. So I think having clear visibility of what's coming down the pipeline, what does the roadmap look like, will be a co-component. So really, strategy should have clear roadmap, and then to kind of hold that roadmap together and make it real, we need the finance side and we need the policy to actually enable it.
Calgary's Mayor Jyoti Gondek urges the federal government to invite municipalities to the table where decarbonization policies are being written to ensure that every region's needs and abilities are taken into consideration.
I think one of the biggest things that we're seeing across the country is the fact that we have different energy sources. And so there can't be a standard solution for everybody. You can't expect someone that's using natural gas right now to shift as quickly to decarbonization as someone that's using hydroelectric power. So I think those differences need to be recognized and appreciated, and the plan doesn't need to be the same in every place. So I think what we've learned as local leaders is that we really have to advocate for how our cities, and therefore our provinces, each have to have a plan that's customized to what we can do in an effective manner and what we can do in an affordable manner.
The decarbonization journey for Canada's cities is as daunting as it is necessary. The steps we take today will shape the future of city living in Canada and set a precedent for sustainable urban development. It's a critical and collective endeavor that requires the participation of every citizen, business, and policymaker. And Canada must act now to get this right.